First of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining today. Today we're going to be talking about how to sell to health systems. Joining us today are two industry experts who will share some of their tactical tips based on their experience on how to build relationships and ultimately sell into health systems. I'm sure if any of you have experience in startups or like kind of newer businesses, you know that health systems can be kind of a beast to deal with. And so we're hoping to sort of illuminate some of the complexities that come with that selling process. My name is Ariele Scharff. I am a B2B marketing specialist. I have worked in startups across healthcare for the last since 2018 and been in B2B marketing and demand generation in tech since 2015. So I'll probably also interject with a few little anecdotes here and there, but I'm really excited to introduce Rachel. If you could tell us a bit about your background and especially your experience at Mount Sinai.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ariel. So, I have been working in the healthcare industry in New York City for the last 14 years. I have worked at two health systems, two health tech startups, and one payer. So, lots of different sides of the industry. Most recently, I was head of consumer digital innovations at Mount Sinai. So, I led a 30-person team that built a custom patient engagement platform. And in that role, I had interactions with vendors who were trying to sell to the health system and who were already involved with the health system. Currently, I'm doing some advising of early stage startups and helping with their go to market strategy for B2B approaches.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel. And Joe, can you tell us a little bit about your background selling into health systems and your current role?
Sure, happy to, Ariel. So I have 7 years experience selling to health systems throughout the US. Most recently, I served as Senior Director of Sales and Customer Service for an innovative life sciences startup known as Secure Transfusion Solutions, or STS. And I'm currently the Head of Partnerships at Pharmacist Healthcare Dashboards, or PHC. I also work with early stage startups in an advisory capacity and a sales capacity to help them to create their first initial partnerships with health systems. Again, it's mostly digital health startups in that area.
That's great. And just for everybody's awareness, we do have a Q&A feature here on Zoom. So please feel free to just drop any questions you have as we go along. We might end up answering them over the course of the session, but if not, we definitely will have time at the end of the session to discuss them. So with that, I'll jump right into it. So let's talk about things from like the big picture. So for folks who haven't worked at a health system, Rachel, can you paint a picture about how these organizations look and how they operate?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple features of health systems to keep in mind as you are looking to approach and work with them. First, these are typically very large organizations. So, even a smaller health system, maybe a single site health system, is typically going to have maybe 5 to 10,000 employees. Medium size, like a Mount Sinai or a New York Presbyterian, 40 to 50,000 employees. And real behemoths like a Northwell Health out in Long Island, that's closer to 80 to 100,000 employees. So if you work at a small organization, some of the ways that things are different at a very large organization are things like people at the organization don't necessarily know folks in other departments, right? So you're going to know people on your immediate team. You might know some folks in some other departments. But at a health system, folks frequently have to reach out to people who they don't have existing relationships with. And that can create some bureaucracy and can create some slowness of things moving forward. Second key characteristic of health systems, these are mostly old organizations. A lot of health systems have been around for over a century. And so as a result, they tend to have established processes where things have been done a certain way for years or decades. And so that can lead to some areas where they may be a little bit set in their ways. And they also tend to have a little bit more of an old fashioned culture. So, for instance, healthcare executives who work in hospitals will often come to meetings in full suits. Whereas if you're at a startup, that's probably not very common. Third characteristic of health systems, this is not a high margin business. So health systems margins often are actually negative. If they're positive, usually it's like low single digits. And as a result, there tends to be sort of a culture of austerity. They're not open with their purses and their pocketbooks. And so, in order to get them to spend money on something new, you have to make a really good case for it. And then the last factor I'll highlight is that health systems are highly regulated. So, of course, all of healthcare is highly regulated, but health systems in particular their auditors often show up in person at their sites unannounced to do audits. So you can imagine how that can create a culture where people are hesitant about taking risks. So all of these factors tend to lead to a culture that is change resistant, that is risk resistant, and that tends to be very consensus based, where people don't want to sort of stick out and be a maverick, but rather want to make sure everyone is on board before moving forward with something.
So in your work at Mount Sinai, I can only assume that you had a lot of cold outreach from vendors. So can you talk through how you interacted with them?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I think a lot of vendors looking to sell to health systems will figure out what is the way that they structure their email addresses, and then kind of reach out to lots of folks who work there. So I would get like a dozen or two cold outreaches to my Mount Sinai email on a weekly basis. I also worked to bring some vendors into the health system that my team wanted to bring on, specifically some contractors who were doing software engineering. And then in my final project at Mount Sinai, where I was working on transitioning some of the departments from our homegrown system to vendor provided solutions, I was working directly with vendors on helping to deploy their solutions in the health system.
And so when you do get these outreaches, do you ever respond? And really, what is it that sticks out to you that has gotten your attention in the past?
Yeah, so usually I don't. I would say there are four factors that determine whether I would respond to a cold outreach, or whether I respond to an outreach. So the first is, what's the medium that they're reaching out to, or reaching out through. So I am most likely to respond if someone is connecting with me on LinkedIn, because that is a platform where I go to make new connections. In contrast, I'm not very likely to respond to an email to my work email inbox, because when I'm there, I'm not looking to make new connections. I'm looking to do my job. And so outreach from someone I don't know trying to sell me something that I'm not looking for just feels like spam. Second factor is whether the thing that the vendor is reaching out to try to sell is at all of interest to me. So I'm in the digital health space. So, if it was a new startup that's doing some type of integration for care navigation or patient experience, like that might be something that I want to learn about at least. But I would get outreach for sanitation products, for parking products, for employee engagement products, and those are all just not at all relevant to my job, so I wouldn't tend to respond. Third factor is what they ask for. People don't like to respond to hard sales pitches. So, if that's how the email comes across, I'm less likely to respond. Occasionally, though, a vendor would reach out and say, "Hey, I see you have a really impressive background in this area. Would love to get your feedback. Could we do a demo for you and see what you think?" And that makes me a little more likely to respond, because they're asking for something that I feel like I can say yes to, and they're flattering me a little bit. And then the fourth factor is, if the outreach isn't actually cold, right? If it's coming from someone who I have somehow interacted with before, maybe they've commented on my LinkedIn posts, or maybe we've been on a webinar before, that makes me more likely to respond.
And I'm sure for some of the people who are tuning in, they have been the ones sending these and kind of painstakingly editing and rewriting these cold outreaches that kind of go into the void of inboxes all over the U.S. in health systems. So for those folks, can you give some examples of some specific outreach you've received that was really great, really resonated, and then maybe some examples that were specifically not so great?
Sure. So, two good examples of outreach. I had one business development rep who found me on LinkedIn, saw a post that I had made with some tips for business development reps, liked it and commented on it, then sent me a connection request and engaged in a conversation where he said, "Oh, your recommendations are so helpful," and then asked me if I would get on a call with his company to take a look at their demo. So, by the time he made that ask, I was warmed up, I was buttered up. And, he had given me something that I wanted, which was engagement with my post. So I was more likely to engage back and give him what he wanted. A second example was a company that reached out to invite me to be a panelist at an online webinar. It was like an all day digital front door day. And so they had found that I did work in that space, and they wanted me to participate in their event. In both of these cases, the common thread is flattery. Flattery is a great approach to get people to feel positively toward you, which makes them more likely to respond. Now, in order to be flattering, you have to customize your message, right? People can tell right away if you are sending a mass message, even if you've done some kind of mail merge and dropped their title right into your template, it's very obvious. So this is not particularly scalable, but you'll get a much higher rate of return if you take the time to customize. In terms of some bad examples, so someone reached out to me wanting to talk to me about selling something to Mount Sinai, and I said, happy to chat, but just want to let you know I'm going to be leaving the health system soon. They said, oh, okay, never mind. And then came back 2 days later and wanted to know if I would refer them to someone else. And the answer there was no, right? I hadn't met them. I hadn't seen their product. I'm not going to refer them blindly. They should have taken my initial offer for a conversation. Another example, I had a rep reach out to me simultaneously to my work email and LinkedIn. I engaged with them on LinkedIn. We had a conversation there. And then a few days later, they followed up on the work email as though I had never responded to them on LinkedIn. So at that point, I feel like, oh, okay, they don't even see me as a person. I'm just a number. They have some sort of automatic email going out. And so that's one of the reasons, one of my tips is don't do the simultaneous outreach through multiple means because it sets you up to make a mistake like that. And then a third example, I had a BDR reach out to ask to set up a call. I agreed to that. And then when the more senior account executive or whatever salesperson got on, they clearly had done no research and asked me during the call what EHR Mount Sinai uses. So at that point, I just sort of felt like they had been really lazy and didn't want to move forward with them.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I think, like, for those of us who are on the other side of it and doing research, some really easy ways to find points of flattery, the points of entry, is that news section on the health system website. That's where you'll see a lot of the highlights. Like, for example, in my line of work, we're selling into health systems who are in the talent acquisition space. So if anybody has won Employer of the Year or Employer of the Region, that's a really easy way for us to start with saying, "Hey, looks like you've done a lot of work to make your place of employment a really great place to work." Entry point to the conversation. So I'll turn it over now to Joe for some more tips on the sales side of things based on your experience. How do you identify the potential in the conversations with contacts who aren't direct decision makers? I'm sure that you have a list of names on your screen and you don't really know who they are. So what is it that you do to kind of like build and create those relationships to get you to the right person?
It's a great question. And it's funny, Rachel touched on a lot of these things already. What happens when you're initially starting? Let's say you're an early stage company and you're just getting started with your outreach. You have a few target health systems in mind, let's say, right, that you'd love to partner with, but you don't know where to start. And if they have 40 or 50 or 80,000 employees, the odds of landing on the right person on the first go, the first try, probably pretty slim. So I've always taken the approach of being open to having conversations with folks at all levels of the health system. And because you never really know what doors that could open for you. And I wanted to share a quick personal story on this level. This is actually how I met Rachel. I posted on Health Tech Nerds, which is a Slack community for the digital health world. And I mentioned that I'm working with a pharmacy data analytics company, and we're looking to connect with health systems, specifically in New York City, where I'm based. And Rachel mentioned that she worked at Mount Sinai, but that she'd be leaving her role soon. And I said, hey, we'd still like to hear your feedback and get to know a little bit more about the work that you're doing and show you a demo of our program. And so the demo went really well. Actually, Rachel gave us some wonderful feedback that we were able to incorporate and to build a stronger product. And then after the call, she mentioned, hey, if you'd like us to make an intro, like me to make an intro, happy to do so. It might be more powerful coming from my Mount Sinai email rather than from just doing cold outreach on LinkedIn. So we identified someone that we wanted to speak with, and sure enough, Rachel was able to make a warm intro, and we were able to secure a meeting with this individual. So that's great. I mean, I think that's a great example of you know making connections, establishing a relationship, and then using that, like leveraging that to reach others within the health system that may actually be your target audience. But you won't necessarily know that going into this cold without having those conversations. So these are really valuable, not to be overlooked. As we mentioned, you could start with a huge list of individuals and kind of blast out your messaging, but the response rate is going to be really low. So if you start with this more customized approach, I think you're going to get better results.
And that takes us back to Rachel. So, um, let's talk about taking advantage of opportunities to connect, even if it's just for feedback. So, Rachel, you have a lot of experience with this kind of outreach. What are some specific advice you'd give companies trying to find their way into that large health system?
Sure. So echoing some of the things that Joe said, I would outreach to a broad audience. I hear a lot of startups say, how do I find the decision maker, right? They want to get right to the senior person. And that actually puts you at a disadvantage. You don't want to have your first conversation be with the senior decision maker. What I think is much more strategic is to talk to more junior folks who can provide you with insight and context that you can then use to shape your pitch so that when you finally do get in front of that decision maker, you have a much richer and more customized story to their institution. So that's one piece. A second piece, as I mentioned, I recommend using LinkedIn as a first approach. If someone doesn't get back to you on LinkedIn, you give them a week, what have you, then by all means, send them an email to their work email if you have that information, nothing to lose at that point. But I would start with LinkedIn. Third, I think it's smart to ask for advice and to try to use that flattery approach, customized if possible, rather than going in with a hard sales tactic. And then last, look for opportunities to get yourself into events where you can meet and connect with your target audience. So if you have a solution that helps with supply chain, look for hospital supply chain events. If you have a solution that helps with surgery, then look for events that target surgeons. And one particular point here is this doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to mean flying to conferences. There are a lot of online webinars that folks join, especially post COVID. And so I've noticed that if you join a webinar, even if you don't have any interaction with a person who's on that webinar during the webinar, it lowers the barrier to be able to reach out on LinkedIn and say, hey, I saw you were also in this webinar. Would love to set up an intro call to learn more about your work.
I love that tip so much, and that's definitely one I'm going to steal and tell my sales team. So, any tips for the first call once they do land that call?
Yeah, so a couple things. One is you want to at least do some cursory research on the institution. So, see if they've been in the news lately. Have they opened or closed a location? Have they had a big strike? Is there any controversy? Just like be aware of any general context that kind of public knowledge that's out there. Second, because health systems are so risk averse, you want to go in with strong evidence that your solution works. So hopefully you've done some kind of pilot, some kind of proof of concept. Health systems don't tend to want to be the trailblazer that's the first one on the cutting edge. They're going to be looking for some of that evidence first. And then lastly, make sure you have a clear financial ROI. So health systems absolutely care about patient experience, absolutely care about quality. However, it's unlikely that they're going to move forward and spend money on a solution if it's only hitting those outcomes. They want to see that you're either going to be able to save them money or increase revenue. And so you want to really focus on those elements during that meeting.
And it sounds like it's really important to understand your audience. So, Joe, can you talk through how you've customized your communications and sales tactics so that it resonates with the health systems that you've worked with?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a few ways. So number one, I think, is to be really clear with your sales communication. So if you're presenting, let's say you're doing a demo or you're presenting a PowerPoint, have a really basic slide deck prepared before you start, and that could be 7 to 10 slides max. And then you could have an appendix at the end that will include kind of questions that you think may come up for that health system that may be relevant, but not necessarily. So it's there in case you need it, but if you don't need it, great, just keep moving. And really, I think the key when developing these presentations is to research your audience a bit, as we mentioned earlier, and to start with a really simple idea, clearly expressed. So, what does your company do? What problem is your company solving? and how is that relevant to the customer? So that should be like, at the forefront. The other thing, number two, is that you don't want to waste time talking about products or services that are not relevant to this health system or to any customer. And number three is you want to keep it simple and allow time for questions. So, there's the tendency to kind of want to fill the space. Don't do that. You want to respect the customer's time. So that this brings me to another point is if you're asking for a 20-minute demo, keep it within 20 minutes. Don't go on for 45 minutes. Respect their time. I think this does two things. So it's obviously it respects everyone's time, as I mentioned, but it's efficient and it's building trust because you're doing what you say you're going to do. And finally, really want to be focused on the customer when you're having these conversations and asking a lot of questions, almost more than you're speaking. So, what are their pain points? So, you've identified a problem. What are the pain points? What are they doing to solve this problem? How is that working? What kind of response are they getting with the current solutions? And this might do two things, right? Number one, it could save you a lot of time. Maybe it's not a good fit for your company. So, you want to know that right away. And this is kind of a discovery call where you'll be able to figure that out. Or alternatively, it may be a really good fit for you, and now you know why, and then you can kind of really focus on those reasons why this could potentially solve their problem. And so that is really key, like to find that problem and to focus on how your solution could work. And to be honest, if it's not a good fit, it's not a good fit. But really, more often than not, you'll get ideas from these calls. You'll things will come up that you hadn't considered, and maybe you could develop even custom solutions based on these conversations. So again, you want to keep that open.
That's such a great point, Joe. And for those of you who use tools like Gong to record your calls or sales calls, there's always usually very helpful metrics so you can see how much of the time were you talking versus the client. And if the prospect is speaking very little, that right there is immediate feedback that you can try and change your approach, get them talking, and listen a lot more. Um, so Joe, back to you again. One approach that many tech companies use is to start off with a pilot before trying to sell a larger implementation. Having been on the startup side of this, there's definitely a lot of internal debate over, is the pilot going to be enough for the client to have skin in the game? Should we charge for the pilot? What level of investment internally should we put into these pilots in order to get the maximum long-term commitment from our target audience? And sort of like, how do we basically price these pilots based on their potential rather than based on the actual value that we're giving to the client in that initial 3-month period or 6 months period? So you've had a lot of experience selling different types of pilots. What's your perspective, and what tips would you offer to startups who might want to partner with health systems on pilots?
So, Ariel, these are all really good questions, and I just want to back up for a minute and talk about why is it worthwhile to even establish a pilot? And I think it can be beneficial to both the startups and to the health systems. So, for the startups, number one, it's a good way to gather case study data. So, when you're first starting, like let's say your first few customers, you won't necessarily have that data yet, and this having these initial pilots and these relationships will allow you to collect real world evidence that your product is working, and then you could develop posters for the industry conventions. You could develop PowerPoints. You could develop articles that you could share in the journals. And so now you're really making a compelling case for why a health system would want to engage with your company. On the health system side, this is a really low risk way to get started with, in some ways, minimal investment of time and expenditure of money to get something going and see if this is a good fit. And finally, it allows for going back to the startups, it allows you to quickly onboard your first customers. And I know with many companies, time is the most important thing, like making sure you have enough runway to get things going. And so these are all essential things that you want to look for. So my suggestions for setting up these pilots is you want to establish predefined metrics and timelines and set expectations. This is super critical in the beginning because you want both parties to be satisfied and to really know the full scope of the work that you're going to be doing. And number two, and this is probably the most important thing for the startups, is you want to have a seamless, triggered approach to your paid partnership. So what do I mean by seamless and triggered? Let's say you identify a 6-month initial trial term. At the end of the 6 months, the normal rate for the service will automatically kick in, and the program will start. And so that will go into the long-term agreement. Let's say it's 3 years, let's say it's 5 years, but this is a great way to bridge that gap. And you want to create an environment where the health systems, again, have minimal risk. And one way of doing that is allow them to terminate the agreement during the initial term for any reason if there's problems, or same thing for the startup. So if it's not working, either party can exit. Now, a lot of companies are doing this as a free pilot for the first 6 months before the normal rate kicks in. Okay, and that can be challenging for some companies because they do need, of course, they need the revenue, right? So an alternative to what I call the freemium model, right, is to start with the 50% rate. So if you're offering to the health system the service at a 50% rate, same termination clause so that they could leave at any time if it's not working, and then at the end of the 6 months, it goes up to the full rate. And this does two things. So this is allowing you to bring in some revenue to support your efforts. And honestly, this will help your other sales work too, going to conventions, doing other outreach that you need to do, and keeping your staff. And finally, that still allows the health system to try your service with minimal risk, right? Because it's only 50% of the rate and they can leave if it's not working. So I think these are some winning solutions that could benefit both parties.
I love how you put that, Joe, as benefiting both parties. And I think, like, as a startup, especially like building a brand that's totally unheard of in a space where it seems like at conferences, everybody really knows everybody. And also, like, at a senior leadership level, they're all bouncing around from one health system to the next. So there really is a lot of sort of cross pollination of both ideas and also references or referrals from of one vendor to the next health system. Um, Something that's critical is building your credibility, and it's so hard to do that before you have a major logo that you can slap on your website, slap on your collateral at events. And so thinking of this as almost like a way to invest in getting that logo, invest in getting that credibility is super important. And it kind of goes back, Rachel, to something that you were saying, which is that you want to be able to bring evidence that you can actually work when you're going to be in that first meeting. What that means is this pilot shouldn't be the first time you've done this. And so, Rachel, I kind of want to turn this to you now and see, like, from inside the health systems, what's your perspective on pilots? Do you view it as like this amazing freebie that you get to just try and it's like great to have and then you can just move on to the next thing? Or is it something that is really worth investing in from an internal resources perspective as well?
Yeah, so one thing I would say pilots are definitely a great way of reducing risk for a health system. And it reduces a couple kinds of risk, right? It's going to be definitely less money than a broad implementation, it's going to be less time. There's also less reputational risk. And I think this one is often kind of gets short shrift. But if you think about your champion, right, the person who's pushing to bring this solution into the health system, if that gets implemented broadly and it fails for whatever reason, that's going to be super embarrassing for that person. And I guarantee that like they're thinking about that risk. However, if they bring you in for a pilot and the pilot fails, that, it's not optimal, but it's not as big of a problem, right? Because that's sort of the point of pilots is you're trying things out. So I think that's one of the reasons that starting with a pilot can be more palatable to a health system. That said, even to do like a single small implementation is still going to take significant time from hospital executives. So, I think that's part of the reason why they'd probably be looking to not be spending a lot of money on the pilot because they're still going to be investing that time. When we think about picking what is the optimal place to do a pilot, right? If you're not doing it, implementing broadly, you want to pick a particular implementation that has a high likelihood of success, right? So you want to pick, say, you're working with a hospital system that has 5 locations with 5 different emergency departments, and you're going to pilot in one of them. You want to pilot in one that's got a strong champion. So maybe the head of the ED is really excited about your project. You don't want to pilot in the one where it's got someone who's super skeptical and doesn't want to try anything new. And then you also want to pilot in a place that's not too big, right? Because if you're doing a big ED versus a smaller ED, then that's going to take more resources. It's going to be more complex, and that's going to both increase the resources that you have to spend as the startup, and it's going to decrease your likelihood of success. Want to echo what Joe said about the importance of agreeing to metrics of upfront. Two details to add to this. One is you want to ask the health system what metrics do they need to see at what target levels in order for them to want to move forward, right? Let them define what success looks like, because then, assuming you're able to hit those, they're much more likely to move forward, right? Versus if you just define the metrics but you don't define the targets, it's easier for them to say, well, I don't know, it could have been better. And then you as the startup should also think about what metrics do you want to measure, right? So that probably you're going to want the ones that the hospital wants, but there might be other ones too. So for example, maybe you're piloting with a health system that's in a rural area with very little competition. And so maybe they're focused on improving costs, but they don't care too much about the provider experience because they're not competing with other health systems for providers. You may still want to gather feedback from providers and maybe survey providers, because then when you're trying to sell to a health system in a more competitive landscape where they're competing with other health systems for doctors and nurses, they may care a lot about the provider experience. So you can ask to collect data even if it's not something that's super important to the health system. And then also to echo what Joe said about the timeline, you don't want to get stuck in a pilot that could go on forever. You want to have a clearly defined timeline and sort of make sure that you are getting everyone back to the table to decide, are we cutting this off or are we moving forward? And hopefully your solution is sticky enough and you've showed impact so they want to move forward.
So let's say a company finds a champion within the health system who wants to move forward with the full contract. Rachel, can you talk about what that process typically looks like?
Absolutely. So first, just setting expectations, it takes a long time. And this comes back to health systems being large, being bureaucratic, being risk averse, being slow moving. So don't expect a quick turnaround. Um, at Mount Sinai, we had a committee that was called the Application Steering Group, and there were, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 folks on this committee, some from IT, some from cybersecurity, folks from different sites within the institution. And anytime any department within the institution wanted to bring in a new tech vendor, they had to go to this committee and get its approval. So there was a form that they'd fill out. What is the solution? What's the vendor? What's the terms of the contract? What's the cost? They would submit that, and then they would join a committee meeting, present that vendor, and then folks on the committee would ask them questions about it. Some common questions would be things like, do they have high tech or high trust or SOC 2 certification? Or something I often saw was, oh, we already have a vendor that we worked with that does something similar. Have you looked at them? So, as the vendor, if you're preparing your champion to go to this committee and advocate for bringing you into the health system, you want to make sure that they are prepared to answer those questions that might come up. So that's the first step. And then if they're not able to effectively or adequately answer whatever questions or concerns folks on that committee have, then they're going to need to go away, get those answers, collect more information, and then wait until the next committee meeting to go back and represent and try to get that approval. So that's step one. Step two, once that committee signs off, then the proposal moves over to the procurement department. And within that, there are a couple different sign offs. So there's cybersecurity. We'll typically have a long form that they'll send to vendors and ask them to answer all of these questions about how they safeguard data. And then there's also the legal team, which is going to work with the vendor to get to agreement on the contracts, like the master services agreement and the BAA. So those can take a while because those teams, they service the entire health system, so they may have many different priorities. And then once sign off is given from those departments, then the contract moves into what we call the signature portal. Now, depending on the total dollar amount of the contract, different folks are going to need to approve it electronically in the portal. So at Mount Sinai, if the contract was less than $100,000, then a director level person could approve it and it could move forward. If it was up to 500,000, then it had to go up to a VP, and anything over 500,000, the CIO had to sign off on. Now, if any of those people are on vacation or on maternity leave, what have you, the contract is going to have to wait until they come back and can sign it. So you could imagine how this process can end up dragging on for a bit.
So, I mean, one question we hear from this audience, and probably everyone's thinking it, is how do we speed this process up?
Yeah. So, couple tips here. One is you want to defer to the health system in terms of any templates that they want to use for contracts. Um, that'll just make it go faster because in the other scenario, if you say, no, no, we really need to use our template for the BAA or the MSA, the lawyer who's got to review that and come, redline it, they probably have a stack of other contracts for other departments within the health system. And that particular one may not be the top priority for them. Whereas you, as the vendor, it's going to be a much higher priority for you to redline their template. So, would encourage you to defer to their templates. And then a second tip is make sure that you are closely project managing like the touch points with the folks who you're working with at the health system to move things forward. So, one tip I have is when you're on a call and you're discussing next steps, you should not only be documenting everyone's next steps and sending around an email with those to make sure you have accountability, but try to schedule the next call while you're on the current call, right? Because once everyone hangs up, like then it just becomes much more difficult to coordinate schedules. And again, assume that moving the contract forward is a higher priority for you than it is for the health system. So any tasks that you can take on as the vendor, that will serve you well.
And it's pretty unlikely in that call that you'll have every stakeholder, given all the different approvals that are needed on that first call. So I think that really goes to the fact that it's more important to both document in the follow-up email, but also on the call themselves to just get the email address of every single person, especially the more senior leaders, so that that thread already exists. They have something they can search when they are reminded about it, and you're not starting from zero with that more senior leader once you finally get in the door with them. Um, Joe, how does what Rachel talked about, everything from the process to contracting terms, to project management, how does that really compare with what you've experienced?
This definitely echoes my experiences, especially the part about the health systems taking, in some cases, longer than we would like. I know it can take years, this process. Um, just a quick story, one of the biggest agreements that I was able to work on over the years took about 3 years. So this involved an initial visit and presentation or proposal to the health system. And we made a really good case, but they came back to us with some critical feedback and said, hey, for this to be taken seriously next time, here's what you need to do. And so we went back and behind the scenes, we had to kind of reorganize a lot of our processes and our operations. But this was a big enough agreement for us to make that worthwhile. So we went back and did that. And then meantime, we kept engaging the customer. We did have some business with this health system. We were a secondary vendor, not a primary where we wanted to be, but we leveraged that. So we met with them quarterly. We showed them all their data. We anticipated any concerns or problems that they may have and responded immediately. So I made this a really big priority. And it took, like I said, 3 years, but we finally got there. We put together a great proposal. We addressed all the objections, and then we ended up forming a partnership and becoming the primary vendor. So it was a really big deal for us. It was a big win, but it did involve a lot of legwork. And so I do want to share with our viewers today that it's not always like that. Sometimes this process can go very quickly. And as Rachel mentions, one of the things you can do to speed that along is to be really easy to work with. Just keep reminding yourself, am I being easy to work with? And one of those things could be in contracting. Don't insist on using your paper if the customer is, let's say, look, we always do it this way. This will move it quicker. Follow their lead. Don't make any additional steps that you don't need to. And I really like the tip about when you're in the meeting, book the next meeting. So remember, anything you could do to minimize friction, that is key. So you, again, minimize the friction and also be easy to work with. Just keep asking yourself, am I doing these things? And if the answer is yes, you're going to move things along quickly.
Joe, I love your self-reflection. I think it's like it really bodes well for the whole process of building partnerships, of being able to kind of see how are you viewed by the prospect and being able to build on the experience you want them to have. And My gosh, that must have felt so good at the end of those 3 years to sign that contract.
Yeah, that was
So
it. Thank you.
yeah. So going to the audience, we have a great question from Michelle. So she asks, how would you recommend startups to launch a pilot if it's really hard to sell into the health system? This came during the time when we were talking about the fact that you need evidence that your pilot is actually going to work and also that you're looking for that credibility. So the question is, should we try to approach smaller private clinics first? I actually would like to take a quick stab at that before I kick it over probably to you, Joe, which is it really depends on what it is your solution is. And if your goal is to sell into health systems, then I would actually recommend selling into a single facility first, because there is a lot more analogous work streams between a single hospital and a health system than there is between an independent practice and a health system, because you might have like a small independent practice that is really like a doctor, an office manager, and like their work streams are really not going to be as analogous to the health system that you eventually want to sell into. But a smaller regional hospital is usually a little bit easier of an entry point than like a Mount Sinai. And Joe, yeah, super interested in your perspective on this one as well.
Yeah, so this one also requires some self-reflection. So I guess you want to start by asking yourself, where are we as a company? So one of the startups I'm working with now, we have this conversation. So like what kind of deals do we want to go after? And we realize we want to be super easy to work with. In some cases, we're going to drop, like, let's say, drop a build fee, make it and things to kind of grease the wheels and move things forward. And that could involve approaching smaller customers and really focusing our energy there. So if you're pre-revenue and you want to get your first customers, I think the focus should be where can you do that the fastest? And Ariel, it could very well be those small hospitals. I've had a lot of success in my career working with the standalone facilities. Maybe they have one or two, they're regional, they have some clinics. They can move really fast if they're motivated to do so. If there's a pain point that you've identified and they're ready to work with you, I think this is a good place to start. So I would definitely encourage our viewers to take that approach if it makes sense for them.
And one thing to go back to Rachel's point of flattery is a lot of times the executives at those smaller systems, they also have their eye towards their ambition of working at a larger system. So being able to implement something and really be successful with it is could be a career builder for them. So yeah, Rachel, curious about your position from being in on the inside of that. How hard is it for a startup to break into a Mount Sinai versus perhaps one of the smaller private clinics?
Yeah, I would say it's definitely easier to start with a smaller organization. And I think to your point, Ariel, it really depends on what your solution is as to whether it's going to apply to a clinic versus you really have to be at a health system. So, for example, if you are working on a product that helps with triaging patients in an emergency room, maybe you'd be able to try that out in like an urgent care clinic first, right? Which might be easier, and then from there, can you move to a single site hospital? And then from there, can you go more to a multi site? However, if you are dealing with a product that needs to integrate with Epic, then a smaller clinic may it's unlikely to be using Epic, right? Like that's really primarily used by hospitals. And so you don't want to waste time doing a pilot in a use case that's just not going to be applicable.
Ariel, one thing I was thinking of adding for this is that some of these smaller facilities, the standalone hospitals or the regional hospitals, they may be acquired at a later date, perhaps very soon by a larger health system. So this could be
Right.
a foot in the door there. So if you think about it long term, this is something you really want to consider too.
That's such a great point. And actually, we are in the process of doing expanding at Vivian Health from a smaller system in the Midwest to what's now a national system based in both the Midwest and the South due to acquisition. So, such a great point there. Any other Q&A questions? I'll leave that Q&A open as we kind of close out the session. And if anything comes up, feel free to drop it in there. And then the panelists were all available to answer additional questions. You can find us on LinkedIn. I think in the follow-up email, we can include some of those links to our LinkedIn profile so that you can message us directly. Um, but in the remaining couple minutes, Rachel, do you have any last words of advice?
Yeah, so I know we've focused a lot during this session on why it's really hard to break into health systems. And I would want to temper that with a reminder that if you can get in, it can it can be worth it if you're able to get in. And the reason for that is because it is so hard for new companies to get in. If you can get in, then you will be the incumbent and you will become the default for that health system. So an example to illustrate this point, at Mount Sinai when we were retiring the homegrown patient engagement platform and we were looking to use vendor solutions to replace it, we needed some chat functionality. And there are a lot of different vendors that provide that in the market. But for this particular project, we didn't do a review of the different vendor options. Instead, someone senior within the IT organization said, well, we already use Avamo for the health system's webpage. And so that's what we'll use for this project. It was the default. And so I think that helps to illustrate why, if you can get your foot in the door, if you can weather the storm to get those approvals, you're likely to kind of be in there for years and the business really becomes yours to lose.
It's a great point. Um, so Joe, I have a couple questions for you from the audience. So the first is, what's an ideal sales cycle time frame? Hopefully not 3 years.
No, that is not that's atypical for sure. It depends on the product you're selling too and, like, the type of the term that you're looking at. So, in general, the longer the term, if you're looking for 3 years, probably gonna take longer. If you're shorter cycle and you're looking for a year, it could be several months, but it really I think that's the fastest it can go typically. But again, it's all dependent on the product and your relationship with the customer. And once you've done business with them, and you've established your credibility, it could move very quickly. They can call you and contract for an additional service. You write an agreement, send it along. I've seen that happen sometimes within a week or two, where you'll get a signed agreement adding a service, so an amendment. So
Wow.
in those ways, things could move very quickly once you have that relationship. And incumbency is a very powerful thing, as Rachel mentioned. Once you're in, you're in it. It really is. You have a lot of stability from that sense as long as you're delivering good service.
Mhm. And do either of you have insights on federally qualified health centers? And would there be more difficult or would it be more difficult or easier to do a pilot with them based on their ties with Medicare and Medicaid, or is the payer not relevant?
Hmm.
I
I don't have
personally
a
have that.
strong feeling there.
Yeah.
Yeah, me either on that particular one.
Yeah, I think that it probably really depends on what your product is. There definitely, um, like when it comes to vendors that work with Medicare and Medicaid, there are kind of like innovation pilots that Medicare does with vendors. So that might be something worth looking into. It's usually like an RFP round. Definitely does take a lot of time to get things like that implemented. But I'm thinking of like a value-based care initiative that was implemented a couple years back. That's my only experience with it though, so I would go to somebody who, maybe has a little bit more experience on that realm.
Yeah, I mean, certain tech innovations are going to be more or less relevant to different health systems based on the population they're serving. So, if you have an innovation that is targeting the over 65 crowd, then that would be those health systems are going to be more likely to be interested in that if that's a large portion of their patients versus, someone like a Mount Sinai or New York Presbyterian that's serving a more general population.
Yeah. All right, well, I think this has been a really helpful, session. I hope everybody on the call felt so as well. Again, you can reach us at LinkedIn. You can just search our names. We're there. Pretty standard names. You can find them, but also we'll send out a link with our LinkedIn's, and we really appreciate all of you taking the time to spend, this Wednesday evening with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.